Good morning and welcome to Humant. I'm here with Ed Bogan. And let me just start by saying that there aren't many people who are described as living legends, but that is something that a lot of people call Ed Bogan. He has been behind some of the most significant national security priorities for the United States. That included leading the hunt for Osama bin Laden. He is a two-time station chief including in Europe. He also served in Asia and Africa, and he spent significant time in Ukraine. He was there in 2014. That was the year that Russia seized the Crimean Peninsula and invaded the Donbass. He was also there during the 2021 military buildup, which then led to Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022. Ed was also there then, and he still goes back. He was there in May. By the way, I don't know if I mentioned that he is retired from the CIA, but he is retired from the CIA, and he still goes back to Ukraine. He was there in May. He was at a conference where he said that former CIA director and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo even spoke at an event and told Ukraine not to lose faith in the West. So I'm so glad that you're here this morning with me to chat. We are a few days out now, Ed, from Trump and Putin meeting in Anchorage, where the red carpet was rolled out for Putin. There is not much to show for it right now, but we're also about to see President Zelensky come back to Washington and meet with Trump. So let's start there. Let's start with the fact that Trump moved away from asking for a ceasefire, which was what Zelensky wanted. He is now pushing for peace. And we saw in February this huge implosion between Zelensky and Trump. Zelensky seems to have wisened up in how he needs to act around Trump, speaking with deference, talking about American strength, saying that he's committed to peace. What are your thoughts on the meeting that's going to happen this afternoon? Is Zelensky in an incredibly delicate position where we might see the relationship sour again? I know I threw a lot at you, but your turn.
Well, first of all, Sasha, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here, and it's been great to get to know you. But yeah, great question. You know, where are we today? Because seems like it's going to be a rather monumental day for a range of reasons. One is because you see all the European leaders are convening, flying here to DC. I'm 10 blocks from the White House where I sit right now. They're coming in, as a show of solidarity for Zelensky. They're coming to amplify his message and their own message about safety and security in Europe. And they're also coming to, advise President Trump on all these positions. I think, we all have, sort of seen the analysis where it's always important to be, some of the kind of last voices in his ear on, some of these really difficult topics. So I suspect that there's going to be, and there has been over the weekend, quite a bit of diplomacy taking place in advance of an engagement with Zelensky, first and foremost, because of the gravity of the issue that's at hand, but also because of what you mentioned, which was, what happened at the last Oval session was, a pretty, it was kind of a political nightmare in a lot of ways, and also an actual setback in relations, and albeit temporary, but it was significant with the intelligence sharing that was stopped after that, and all these peripheral matters that actually have pretty significant consequences.
Yeah, I mean, The Economist has reported that a Ukrainian intelligence officer said the Americans are pressuring Ukraine to forfeit land.
Yeah, I think, I saw that as well, and I think we're gonna know that today. I think we're gonna have a good sense of the tea leaves by the end of today. While there might not be total clarity, I think we'll be able to read between the lines on all the key leaders' statements coming out of today. I think, it's a pretty big shift to say, hey, we need to get to the agreement part of this phase, not start with the ceasefire. I think President Zelensky has been pretty clear, and European leaders have backed him in that the first step is an actual, real, meaningful ceasefire, and then we can sit down and have discussions. And to skip to the sort of let's finalize this now phase, I can't see that happening today with any kind of final decision, simply because the Ukrainian constitution won't allow for President Zelensky to simply just make an utterance and then that is that. I mean, there's a process on their side. They still are a rule of law country. It's a democracy. They have a robust constitution, and they're going to have to work through a range of things, and that's irrespective of whatever positions come out today, which seems to be, a little confused. I mean, we saw, the special envoy Witkoff went to Moscow last week. As a result of his trip, sort of the messages coming out were inconsistent and a little confused in terms of what exactly was put on the table. So and I think it's still the case that it's not exactly clear, like what sort of quid pro quo, so to speak, on like you give land here, we'll give land there sort of actual agreement is on the table. Is it de facto? Is it de jure? There's a lot of questions I have in terms of like, even what today represents in terms of let's get to a deal.
And you had also mentioned briefly in the first answer that Trump is often influenced by who he last spoke with. And so the fact that this shift has now occurred whereby instead of focusing on a ceasefire, it is about let's figure out what land the Ukrainians are okay with giving up so that there can be with some kind of security guarantee for the Ukrainians. Um, uh, but how much did Putin potentially influence Trump? We watched the very brief meeting for journalists where Putin spoke first, which was notable. Trump only spoke for a few, I think 3 minutes after Putin spoke. And what I noted was that when Putin alluded to Biden, the previous president, that was when Trump actually turned his head at the podium to look at him. And he fed Trump a lot of what Trump likes to say himself, which is that this would never have happened if Trump were president. We would never have invaded. It would never have gotten to this point. So Putin seems to have found certain nodes that Trump really gravitates toward. He seemed to have offered them up. How much do we believe that Putin was able to influence Trump and now needs to be undone by not just Zelensky, but probably mainly European leaders who are also arriving today?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, because I think that's the fundamental issue, right? And it's the question. The question is to what extent, the details transferred from Putin towards Trump, in terms of how Putin often comes out with a very maximalist position, and so do his sort of several mouthpieces. And the question is that what was sort of put on the table behind closed doors, and Trump is sort of, taking that position now and trying to frame it in a way that's, consistent with where he thinks he needs this to get. I think those are good questions that you're framing. And again, I think we're going to have some clarity today. And again, there's still going to be some prognostication that comes out of the tea leaf reading at the end of the day. But I think we're going to have a lot more actual sort of fodder for saying, okay, this is probably what was said behind closed doors in terms of what will make this stop.
So basically what you're saying is when we were planning this last week, we should have planned it not for today, but for like tomorrow or Wednesday.
Yeah, I think right now it's
Yeah.
No, and it's look, it's hard to speculate on this because there's a range of points of confusion, right? Like, one is Putin typically comes off as a very, like I said, with a very maximalist position. It doesn't sound completely maximalist in terms of what is coming out of president's mouth. The president is also relying on Witkoff, who I would say, is not exactly making utterances that are on the same point, even with like Secretary of State Rubio. So they're they're close, but they're not quite there. So I and then the other part of this, of course, is we have a dynamic conversation ongoing. So like, even though they may not be crystal clear, like here's the 10-point solution that we are pushing, there's a discussion that has to take place today. And it's not just a discussion with Zelensky, because and first and foremost, it's most important about Ukraine. So it is Zelensky is going to have a strong view on this, but also again, the European leaders are coming in, and we keep reading. You read the pundits out there, and they're saying, okay, well, Europe, particularly the Baltic and Nordic 8, are very much aligned with Zelensky's position. The UK has been very strong in its defense of Ukraine, but at the same time, we're seeing things that suggest, the United Kingdom, of course, values the special relationship it has with the United States and doesn't want to put that in question. So, there's some skepticism being inserted into the narrative right now and say, okay, well, where's the UK on this? The fact that Macron is coming, that Meloni is coming, I mean, it's very interesting. The heaviest hitters in the European Union right now are coming, and I think this is a monumental day, because I think just by virtue of everything I just said, like, this is a monumental day where you have these leaders coming in to say very forcefully, this is our position, this is the way it has to be. What's the this, right? Like, fundamentally, this is what we're talking about. What's the this in that statement I just said? And we're not going to find that out. We're going to find out a large portion of it later today.
Are the Europeans going to be able to decisively support Ukraine,
This is a
whatever
great question.
happens?
So in some of my conversations with friends, we're having these discussions right now saying, okay, well, what are the leverage points? If you wanted to have an extreme, sort of painting of this picture, you could say, well, there's the tariffs. The United States could pressure the Europeans to capitulate based on tariffs. And sort of my response to that is, okay, maybe. I think the bond market had a pretty strong reaction to, the sort of Independence Day. Like, it showed that there are limits to how far you can go with these kinds of things. The NATO cohesion argument is also on the table. Say, well, the president could continue to advance a narrative that we may withdraw from NATO. I think that's speculative. I think what we've seen earlier this year is that's not the case. And I have to think that if you were a key leader in Europe and that were presented to you as an actual position, that kind of an extortive type of position would probably ruin the credibility of the person on the other side of the table from you. If someone said, hey, we're not going, if you do that, we're not going to back up NATO anymore unless you go along with this deal, then there really isn't a NATO on the other side of that. Even if you went along with it to sort of ease through the moment, I don't think you have a NATO on the other side of it, and key leaders know that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's also interesting to think about what the security guarantees could be, because there's already been security guarantees that the United States has claimed with Ukraine, and it hasn't worked out so well for Ukraine. I mean, if we go back in time,
correct,
there has been agreements. There's the Chicken Kyiv speech. I mean, right. We have a history with this country. So I'm wondering, what does Ukraine deserve, and what are they likely to get?
Yeah, so this is a great question. This is probably the point I'm most confused on, what exactly is on the table. And I did quite a bit of reading yesterday and also this morning, trying to see what the positions are here. What does it mean with this Article 5 set of guarantees that would be put into legislation in the Duma? I don't know what that even means, right? That's
essentially, yeah, right. How, under what circumstances the United States come to Ukraine's aid,
right,
in an Article 5 way, yeah,
right. Yet no NATO, membership for definitively stated at the same time. So again, I don't want to call it a word salad. That's not fair to the interlocutors, but it just seems like a range of clauses linked together that I can't make sense of.
So I found it curious that CIA Director John Ratcliffe attended the meeting, was in Anchorage, along with several other Trump administration officials, but he wasn't in the 2.5, 3-hour meeting. That was Secretary of State Marco Rubio and the Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, who joined Trump. And the Russian counterparts along with Putin. From an intelligence
Mhm.
perspective, what is your read on that?
Mhm.
And do you, I guess, okay, let me just start
Yeah.
there with Ratcliffe having been involved, but not having been in the most important moment of uh, the entire summit.
Well, we don't know what other meetings were taking place there on the margins at a lower level. So it very well could be that that was an opportunity for, Ratcliffe to meet with someone else, a counterpart of some sort, on any number of ongoing discussions that we may not be cited on. And it could have to do with, prisoner exchanges. It could have to do with a wide array of issues that are, bilateral irritants at this point. And secondly, I think being there at least allows him to be an advisor for the president as needed. Should he have questions that need to be sort of sorted out in real time? And it probably has more to do with the president's style and what he expects. And he may just say, okay, this is not someone that gets a seat at this particular table, but I need this person close to me so that, if something comes up, I can address it immediately.
How well is the United States understanding Putin and his intentions? And then on top of that, is Trump listening to it?
So I don't, when you say how well is the United States, I mean, we're talking about the United States government. I think, and to some extent the public, but I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about the Russia's intent vis-a-vis Ukraine here. I mean, I think I do believe it is a maximalist sort of position that Putin has, and I think that the full erasure of Ukraine is actually the goal here. I don't think we understand that. I do think many of the Europeans do, particularly in the East, viscerally understand that, given what they have been through, what their parents have been through, what their grandparents have been through, and the stories that they're very well aware of. Um, I think this is dangerous because you see many things come up in some of the public pronouncements that get closer to kind of Russian narrative. And Russia is no slouch at this. I mean, they have been managing the information space for a long time. They're expert at this, and they make sure their narratives are dispersed throughout the world. And their narratives, very broadly, are not even consistent with each other, but it doesn't matter. They're just out there to sow doubt in a range of things that bring cohesion to countries, to democracies, to multilateral institutions. And Russia doesn't need to build anything. They just need to break things. I mean, that's in one sense, it's much easier to break things than to build things.
There's also a sense that Trump believes that if he sits down with somebody, he can make a
Hmm.
deal. That,
Hmm.
yes, there is this entire intelligence apparatus that has been studying Putin and studying his intentions, his triggers, his inclinations. But it seems as though Trump believes that if he sits down one on one, that he thinks that he can make progress and that he has the ability to push in a way that nobody else could. So is he listening to what the CIA has to say on Putin himself?
Great question. I'm sure he's getting briefings. The question is, how much is it sinking in? Is, compared to some of the other messages that he's getting. I don't know, sort of, kind of how he structures his close in sort of advisors on this issue. I don't know who his best and brightest are, but I know that the agency will consistently put together what it needs to in terms of binders full of, psychological profiles, likely sets of talking points that are coming, ideal responses, all kinds of supporting material. The question is whether it's digested, or the key interlocutors around him, the close-in interlocutors, are they digesting it and then, using that as they're advising him, which very well may be the case. But um, as I said before, I think you do see there is a strength to Russia's narrative game, and it does come out in our system. Unfortunately, you see it in various interlocutors over time.
Hmm. Are you talking about specific people or media outlets or?
No, I think it's pretty. Unfortunately, it's pretty ubiquitous. I mean, it's stronger in some places rather than others, but I do feel like And Ukraine's done a good job of explaining on a regular basis exactly what's going on. I think they've done a masterful job, and we can learn a lot from them and how they've done their narrative to make sure, their counter narrative game, so to speak. But it's again, the Russian narrative is ubiquitous.
Yeah. I mean, uh, one of Trump's former advisors, Russia expert Fiona Hill, had this incredibly powerful quote in a Wall Street Journal article I read last week.
Mhm.
Quote, Putin wants maximalist objectives to secure his legacy as Vladimir the Great and is willing to engage in mass slaughter, while Trump wants to stop the war and win the Nobel Prize for Peace. So, considering
Mhm,
that,
mhm.
I mean, these are entirely different objectives.
Yes.
And yet, while the lunch was called off and we don't know exactly what happened, there was reporting that some of his teammates, like Caroline Levitt, appeared ashen faced after these meetings. I'm wondering, what are your impressions of
Mhm.
this evolving relationship between Trump and Putin when they ultimately do have incredibly different goals?
Yeah, and I think so. So there was something that I think was a little bit of a tell during the press conference that something is up, and along those lines of this disconnect is real. One, when there's a press conference of this consequence, I would have expected Trump to have made a pretty clear proclamation of some sort coming out of it, and it was more of a, well, we've agreed on a bunch of things, and we've got some stuff we got to sort out with the Europeans um, and Zelensky. Although I don't feel like he spent a lot of time talking about Zelensky during the press conference. And the second thing was, he typically, and this is related, is he likes to battle with the press after these proclamations when people start to ask for clarity, or ask these very questions like, well, what about Putin's a war criminal, blah blah blah, and he wants to kind of attack people for maybe you know why they asked that question rather than answer the question. Neither of those things took place, and the fact that the lunch was canceled, like all of that together, seems like there was a disconnect, and it was not final. Like it wasn't remedied. So again, I think we're gonna have some further light shine on that later today when once we start seeing some of the results of today's discussions. But because we have also heard the president say multiple times, there's a scenario where I'm just out. Um, and I'm wondering, like, are we kind of on the precipice of that? Is behind closed doors, is Putin very maximalist, like Fiona Hill is almost certainly correct? Um, and does Zelensky come back and say, like, we cannot agree to any land swaps whatsoever. We can only agree to a ceasefire, and then we can sit down and talk. And the Europeans come and back that. At that point, Trump's going to have to sort of say, like, all right, where do we find common ground here? And there may not be any. Does he get frustrated and say, I'm moving on to mail-in voter issues, like
Mm.
his tweet this morning?
But the thing is, if there was a disconnect, then
Hmm.
why did he end up saying things that really kind of take him closer
Hmm.
to Putin's view of what should happen next in finding an end to this war?
Hmm.
I mean, he moved closer in
Hmm.
his
Hmm.
in his comments to Putin than he did in previous days, where he said, we're not going to talk about peace. It's going to be about a ceasefire. We're not going to talk about land swaps." That's what he promised to the Europeans. Um, and also, essentially, it seemed like there was a potential for normalized relations beginning here when Putin went beyond talking about the war and talked about the fact that we're just really essentially neighbors, and there's a lot of good that can come between our countries. It felt like, at least on his side, he wants to move past this, like, oh, this little full scale invasion where
Yeah.
all of these people are innocently dying. But that's just a side note. Let's actually get down to business now.
I think if you look at kind of values-based proclamations related to Ukraine, related to Russia, whether it's this administration or the previous, they're radically different. I do think that the objective in many ways for Trump is to get past this war, get back to business. And he's very familiar with doing business in Russia, and he wants to get back to that that sort of state of a relationship and get Russia back engaged with the world. I don't think he's, the only value-based statement he sort of consistently makes is about like stopping the killing, but I don't know that he actually like that. That just seems more of like a kind of a Pavlovian thing to say when anyone initially raises the war with him. It's generally it's a sort of a two-step of like, this wouldn't have happened if I was president, and there's too many people dying, and then like as if that's the sort of the intellectual position that the United States is taking, and it doesn't seem sincere to me. I don't think he's I don't think he's aligned with kind of what Ukraine represents here, right? This is a fight for freedom. It's a fight for a democracy to have agency, to have sovereignty. This is that's not He's not invested in that. He's just not invested in that. Whereas I do think the previous administration was heavily invested in again, I keep using the word narrative, but like there's a narrative thing there. It's not insincere, but there's a narrative that to push there. And the previous administration certainly was consistently pushing hey, like this is about freedom. This is about agency. This is about sovereignty. Just don't hear that. We haven't heard that from anyone in this administration, with the exception of occasionally, Keith Kellogg, the special envoy for Ukraine, who's made a lot of, positive statements, but also a lot of measured statements.
And hasn't been the one who goes to Moscow. That's
correct.
Witkoff, because the Russians don't like Kellogg.
Correct.
Yeah. So here's another thing that I found so fascinating. According to NPR, there were several pages of information that were actually left by the Trump administration in the hotel. Yeah. Details on meetings and about a gift, a bald eagle statue for a desk that was meant to be given to Putin. As a former CIA operations officer, what do you make of that?
Yeah, and that's just terrible, right? You don't want anything like that to happen. Obviously, it's a bad look, but I mean, it's more than a bad look. I mean, because there's information in there there's going to be valuable information in some manner in there, and it's not just about leaving it in a printer. I mean, it's who knows how many nation states were like conducting technical operations and trying to like focus on this set of meetings and try to exploit that. I mean, who knows what was sent through that printer? And I don't even want to speculate. I'm sure there was no classified sent through, but
yeah,
sensitive information. It's a big mistake. It's a big mistake.
Okay, I'm not hearing any printer gate thus far.
It's, I think there's bigger issues, right? But it's not inconsequential and it's not insignificant, but there are much bigger issues. So I think it'll get drowned out. The Signal episode was kind of a forefront story.
Yeah, right.
I don't know that this one's going to become that. And, there's no suggestion. I've seen no suggestion that classified information was there. I'm sure it was all sensitive though.
Yeah.
Sensitive and interesting.
Yeah. So let's think about Ukraine right now a little bit more. With Russian forces making some gains in the east in Dobropolia, and if Zelensky and Trump don't get along well today, is Ukraine going to need to rely more on sabotage operations? We saw several months ago Operation Spiderweb, which had been this incredibly brilliant operation where they hid drones that then were targeted on long-range weapons, gave them a huge advantage at a time when the United States still has had parameters on using Western weapons to target Russia. So tell me about your thoughts on whether or not Ukraine is going to take this moment to try to shift gears, and whether or not these operations by Ukrainian intelligence services are going to play an increasingly important role.
Yeah, I think so. So a couple things I want to pull out of that. First, the initial statement about the sort of gains that were reported early last week from Russia. Those were overstated. There was a breakthrough that was not consequential, that Ukrainian forces surged to and were able to push back. These happen, and again, um, over time, the numbers favor Russian forces when you look at the population they're drawing from compared to the population that Ukraine is drawing from, and the limits that they currently have on the age of those who are being pulled into the fight on the Ukrainian side. And but to get to the sort of sabotage operations, deep strikes, without question, those are crucial. If you look in the last week, one issue I follow closely is the Russians' use of Shahid drones to terrorize largely civilian populations, terrorize and kill civilian populations around Ukraine
The
on
Iranian missiles.
on a regular basis.
I mean, not
And
drones, but yes.
yeah, right. But the Russians have been able to, take that Iranian technology, and basically they have multiple fabrication plants in various parts of Russia. There's a port related to shipments that come from Iran. It's sort of a tributary off the Caspian. Multiple locations, including that port and two fabrication sites, over the last, say, 10 days or so, have been struck by long range Ukrainian attacks, which is to be expected. I mean, they're trying to hit strategic targets that can impede Russia's ability to terrorize and kill Ukrainian civilians. So the deep strikes matter, right? And they're obviously, we all have watched closely as they hit oil and gas infrastructure, because that's where Russia really has its war chest, comes from continuing to pump as much petroleum out as they can and sell it to those who will buy it. Largely China and India. And so hitting those sort of core infrastructure targets over and over is crucial. Concurrently, the Ukrainians have spent a lot of time over the last several years destroying armor, destroying aircraft, destroying ships. As many as they can. So constantly diminishing the Russian capabilities, like that's sort of an ongoing drumbeat as well. And um, yeah, that attack you noted, that was conducted by SBU, the Security Service of Ukraine, the internal service, was tremendous, and they need more of that. And I think those kind of surprise attacks that have crippling effect on things like strategic bombers that Russia only has so many of, and they're not going to be able to rebuild quickly, is crucial to their survival.
And do you have a sense that they are kicking up efforts to engage in more of those kinds of operations, considering where we are today, where people are wondering whether or not Trump and Zelensky are going to have a meeting that leads to another televised debacle, or if Putin has just been able to plant seeds in Trump's head that can create problems between the US Ukraine relationship?
So that's a great question, because we saw this in the previous administration, where it kind of came out that the White House was not happy with deep strikes, was not happy with strikes against oil and gas infrastructure, and we've seen that hasn't really raised its head in this administration as a point of conversation at the highest levels. So that, I find that interesting, because I wonder, sort of like, if you're not in the weeds on the sort of, what's a better way to say that? When you're in the weeds, like the previous administration was, on like every sort of contour of the war and trying to sort of stage manage the risk, this risk calculus that was constantly sort of a feature of any consideration of adding another capability or dimension to the fight. That's all absent now, which I think is because I do think that there's a kind of a myopic focus on how do we get to the other side of this war? How do we get to a point where we're on the other side of it? And again, with like a priority of Ukraine's sovereignty as a principle that is driving the discussion.
Right. Yeah. I think that the Biden administration, there was a real fear of escalation.
Hmm.
And so, in some ways, they tied Ukraine's hands, and
Yes.
it took years for Biden to roll back some of the red tape on what the Ukrainian forces could do. Uh,
Yeah, and the previous administration took did quite a bit of good, but it also, did a lot of things sort of late, and also often, based on assessments that would prove to be overly cautious and consistently. That's unfortunate, because of where we are now. We could have probably been much farther along in defense of Ukraine, but I I'm still thankful for everything we did. Um,
Yeah, and but it is interesting to note that we don't see, at least publicly, any problem that this administration has with the Ukrainians striking deep into
right.
Russia. I actually was surprised that we didn't get any messages or posts on Truth Social from the president talking about Zelensky escalating or
Mhm.
not really wanting peace. Seems like it was almost just ignored.
Yeah, and again, I think that's a tell too, just about the nature of the conversations that are taking place in the White House are probably really just more focused on like getting to the other side of this and not litigating the how.
And so when the United States, based on Trump's order, paused intelligence,
Mhm.
uh, are the Ukrainians fearful that that could happen again?
Um, the Ukrainians are very adaptable. I think yes. I think the short answer is yes. The long answer is yes, but, and the yes, but is, they will, first of all, they have incredible collection capabilities of their own. And nothing, you're always going with a very broad kind of mosaic, when you're in sort of a scenario where you have lots and lots of countries contributing in some manner. And obviously the United States contributes quite a bit. But you can compensate for aspects of things. Can't compensate for all of it, but you can compensate for aspects of things. And increasingly, Ukrainians, even when you just look at like hardware, like they're increasingly making their own hardware. They're obviously conducting audacious operations as well as like developing ballistic missile capabilities, which are coming online right now, which you see in the news. So, and then you see, since our new administration came into the office, I think you've seen the Europeans change their own narrative about how they talk to themselves and talk to each other about what they need to do. And of course, they're not a monolith. The EU is not a cohesive thing that is doing something. It's like each of these countries has their own views, and there's certainly the Slovakias and the Hungaries out there. But you have a lot of countries that are leaning in heavily, like Denmark, like Finland, like Poland, like Estonia, like the United Kingdom, Norway. You have countries leaning in very hard and realizing they have to do more and more and more. So all that to say, yes, the short answer, yes, there's a huge risk of us sort of not helping anymore. Um, but the reality is, Ukrainians are increasingly helping themselves. Other partners are increasingly stepping up. Russians are, still struggling financially. Like there's an equilibrium space that has always existed in this war, where you've got this sort of equilibrium band where Ukrainians are doing better some days and less so on the others, and Russians are doing better some days and less so on others, and Europeans are supporting better, and and the same with the Americans, and we're still in a bit of a equilibrium band where one of the things I say is neither side really has a boot on the other's neck. If one side did, this war would probably end quickly. Neither side is in great shape. Um, so this is just a long slog, a long, painful slog. And I think we're constantly in a state of discussion, whether it's in blogs and podcasts and articles. We're like, well, how does it end? How does it end? I'm like, we've been having that conversation for 3 years, and we sort of run the risk of missing the forest for the trees. Is we're kind of still in this band, and we're going to be for a while, I think, unless something comes out of today, or a continuation of discussion comes out of today. You got three things here, right? Like something's going to come out of today, or the White House is going to walk away, or there's going to be a continuation of discussions, which is, I mean, these are really our outcomes.
It's
Um,
it's curious that as much as the president and this administration have threatened that they could walk away,
mhm,
Trump really seems to have doubled down in wanting to make this happen.
mhm,
And he
mhm,
has even I think it was today he uh, like retweeted or retruth socialed, or I don't know, I suck at tech
yeah,
verbiage. But, these lists of deals that he has made between
yeah,
countries to prevent conflict or to stop escalation. And it's like he wants this to be the crowning achievement of his second term. But as and feel free to jump in if you
Yeah.
have something to say on that, because I've got another question at the ready here for you, Ed.
Well, no, but I know I do have a comment on that. If let's just say hypothetically today doesn't go well, you know, Zelensky says, "Look, we can't make any capitulations other than agree to a ceasefire," and Europeans fully back that, and Trump gets frustrated and in some meaningful way says, "Look, we're out. You guys sort this out." That's a loss for him because I do think he wants to get again to the other side of this, to a world where Russia's back in the fold. They can, we can do things with them, and we're on the other side of this conflict. And if he walks away, the conflict continues, and it will be hard. It's going to be hard on the Ukrainians. It's going to be hard on the Europeans. It's going to be hard on Russia, but it's going to continue, and it's probably going to continue for a while. And that's going to be, a constant thorn in his side. And that's, I don't see him as a person who wants to be sort of irrelevant on something. So he's staying engaged in what he really wants. He wants a capitulation of some sort today, a kind of a unified capitulation, say, okay, we can do X, Y, and Z, like some kind of Minsk style agreement of some sort that
Even
gets
though that agreement ended up meaning ultimately
right.
nothing.
And all the agreements, you mentioned it before, like so many agreements along the way, going back to Budapest, like they just don't seem like they've been, and that's the nature of, this is the problem, right? Like this is we step back philosophically, this is the state we're in, rule of law, a world of, liberalism. These are a handshake. These are choices we all make, and you can also choose not to adhere to this stuff. So that's kind of what we're dealing with right now. Like everyone kind of comes to agreements. They all have their press conference, they sign the documents, and we've got an agreement, and then it kind of just doesn't matter years later. That's kind of like a feature of what we're dealing with on a lot of issues right now, is like the fraying of kind of the world we've been in sort of post World War II, right?
It's really depressing when
Mm.
you describe it that way, but certainly there are examples of that, as you mentioned. Uh, Given whatever happens today, there has been a shift in priorities and policies with the Trump administration as compared to the Biden administration.
Mhm.
Do the Ukrainians still trust U.S. intelligence and the people
Yeah.
who are giving them information, even as we see some of these challenges arise?
There are very strong relationships that have been forged over the last 11 years. And those relationships are based on trust and results and effort. And those are still there. And that matters. And, um, I can tell you, there's a lot of love out there between a lot of people, just sort of like having each other's back and trying to get it to the right outcomes. Um, our intelligence processes, methods, it is trusted. The question is going to be, to what extent is it shared? And I'll, we have this discussion a lot, and there's a nuance here, and I think this is a good venue for having a discussion on what I'm about to say. We talk about intelligence sharing and how important that is. We share all kinds of things, but there's something else. There's, I use the word kind of the jointness of it. When you're sitting there shoulder to shoulder and you're working together with them all day long, and you're living there. You're there for a year. You're there for 2 years. You're there for 3 years. Whatever the assignment ends up being, depending on what sort of chapter we've been in over the last 11 years. There is great power to that jointness when we are learning from each other, when we are understanding what each other needs, when we are advocating back to our respective headquarters to say we need to stop doing X, we need to start doing Y, or we need a little more of Z to move the needle. And that's what I worry about, kind of degrading, because that's an easy one, where you just say like, okay, well, we've got X number of people in a station, and now we're going to have, 20% of X, next year. And then it just sort of starts to just narrow and narrow and narrow. And the scope of the relationship, the depth of the relationship immediately diminishes just because of lack of time on target.
Hmm. Interesting. Okay. There are two other developments
Mhm,
that I wanted to bring up. One, somebody that you know, CIA veteran Ralph Goff, he
mhm,
had been in the running, saw his chance to be chief of clandestine operations for the CIA withdrawn. He was a staunch supporter of Ukraine.
mhm,
And then, second, having done extensive reporting on the State Department in these last few weeks, I can tell you that several intelligence analysts who had deep expertise in Russia, they lost their
mhm,
jobs. I'm not sure if the Ukrainians are aware of these things happening inside the SBU, the HOR, which is the military
mhm,
intelligence service, domestic intelligence service being SBU. I don't know if they know on a deeper level about some of these developments, but I wanted to get your take on what these
mhm.
developments ultimately mean, what the implications are for that.
Yeah, if it's, I do think they're tracking. I do think they're tracking this closely. And they know they know who are advocates, for them. When Ralph was when his name started to circulate, I definitely heard from friends in the field who were, happy to hear that someone with actual depth of field experience could potentially, lead the directorate, because as you know, there's a lot of consternation still over the modernization, the modernization that took place inside the agency. Particularly, there's a lot of consternation in the DO. There has been since day one, and
Director of operations for
mhm,
everybody watching.
sorry, and yeah, so having someone in the position of deputy director for operations, the senior most position of the directorate of operations, the DO, with that kind of field experience would be what was expected before modernization. What was expected of someone in that position, someone who's been there, done that 20,000 times and has dealt with everything 20,000 times. Um, it's, if I have to say like something positive out of it, I think that when he wasn't selected, I know, a person was selected internally, to take the position. And that's probably better, to kind of remove the political aspect of it, because the position is pretty crucial that the person be apolitical. Um, you have to be able to speak truth to power to the director, to say like what we can and can't do, and what a relationship with a foreign partner is, and what's not trustworthy, and who's lying to, maybe coming out of meeting with the president and be like, look, we've got collection, this is what that person said, this is what they really meant. And you need to be able to have that conversation, even if it's someone that the president's friends with and likes. So, if anything, I could say that, if after Ralph, they were seeking another candidate from the outside, there's certainly great people that have retired that could come back and do the job quite well. But I think maybe just keeping it in house kind of sort of removes a portion of the politics, or the optics of the politics.
So, how do the Ukrainians feel about who was chosen?
That I don't know. That is less, I think it's more important who they're dealing with on the ground, in a lot of ways, in Ukraine, who's on our team. And then sort of who is on the accounts, who are in the leadership positions on the accounts in Washington, who basically would effectively report to the DDO. That's going to be where that's the stickiness. That's the people that are going to be not only, just reading everything all day, every day. They're going to be taking frequent trips. There's going to, whether we have liaison partners coming to the United States, or whether we go out there for bilateral discussions, or if there's something happening in third countries, like that's where the stickiness happens, that matters the most to them, because they can basically speak with authority to someone who understands exactly what they're talking about. And then that person can carry the water up to a DDO, who then has to carry the water up to the director and say, this is our recommendation here.
Mm-hmm. But can you give me a sense
Mhm.
of how the Ukrainians are feeling
Yeah.
based on what they see happening inside the US intelligence community
Yeah.
since
It's,
January 20th?
um, I I think they're concerned about what I mentioned before, the jointness aspect of just the ability to um, stay committed as far forward as possible, which is basically on the ground in country. I think that's it's hard to explain the scope and the depth of things we did together. I can't explain it obviously because it's classified, but even if I could, it's extremely difficult to explain just how um, what the breadth of partnership is and was with them. So I think the biggest risk is if we just don't have people on the ground working with them in the same numbers. And I have no insight into whether or not that's, there's been a drawdown. What I'm saying is I think that's the biggest risk right now is, I think to me is not so much the intelligence sharing, but it's the actual like meat and potatoes of partnering, the actual partnership, but
Mhm.
the work that goes into partnering.
And you were there in 2014. That was when the relationship began to form.
Mhm.
Can you describe how the relationship developed? And I mean, I know that that is a very, very long conversation that we
Yeah.
could spend literally hours just talking about this one thing. But to see the CIA build up a
Yeah.
relationship with the SBU, with HOR, um, tell us about that.
So I have a very like myopically American way of describing this, which is probably not appropriate, but I would often say like this was kind of a 9/11 moment for them with what happened with Crimea and the Donbass. And what I saw, from young people working in the services was an incredible combination of dedication, patriotism, fear, anger, fire, all of it. Um, and also from the leadership. So it wasn't just at the working level. It was great. And what it led to was I think kind of just two sides looking at each other and saying, let's take a chance. Like, what do we think we can do here? And it's hard to describe how quickly it blossomed into so many different areas of Venn diagram overlap of mutual interests, and certainly um, GWAT era, we had a lot of partnerships. We also developed a lot of uh, partner services, and I would say that from working with the Ukrainians, we learned quite a bit. Not just taught. Incredibly capable set of services, and who definitely could learn from us, but we definitely could learn from them.
Yeah, is that mutual respect still there? I mean, what when we talk about Operation Spiderweb, I
Mhm,
mean
mhm.
that's like some Mossad level shit right
Yes, it
there.
is.
I mean, it was staggeringly brilliant, and its execution. Um,
And that's necessity, right? I mean, there are things in our history that are pretty phenomenal, but they're infrequent, because it's necessity tends to drive these kinds of moments. And there's just an overflow of necessity on the Ukrainian side. So you're seeing more and more audacious operations. I mean, some of the things that HOR, the military intelligence has done, even something like, and you can read about this in the news, there's articles on, the missions that Corps was taking into Mariupol when forces were holding out in the in the steel plant, and putting themselves at an enormous risk to get wounded out to replenish fighters and supplies. Unbelievably audacious and aggressive things
did
that they've been doing
so
since the
so
beginning.
so did that was that learned um, from the CIA, or like, how
Mm,
did all of that develop
yeah,
ultimately?
yeah,
I mean, we obviously have to give credit to the
mhm,
Ukrainians,
yeah, absolutely.
absolutely, but I'm just wondering that, was it the level of training that they got from the Americans starting in 2014 that led to those moments?
I wouldn't put a straight line. I would just say that's it's a factor. I think it's a factor because I mean we've worked with them for a long time now, building their capabilities. But they already had, like I said, an incredible set of capabilities and in their own history of excellence. So yes, yeah, the short answer is yes. And again, like before, the long answer is, it's yes, but, and it's the but is, followed by all those things I just said.
Mhm. And okay, I know that there isn't anything that you're going to be able to give me here
Hmm.
that's really specific, but before the invasion,
Hmm.
we would constantly see Jake Sullivan, we would see John Kirby coming out onto the podium at the White House to say that the Russians are getting ready to invade.
Hmm.
This is how we think it's going to happen. That required real declassification
Hmm.
efforts and partnership with the United States as European allies. At the same time, if the United States is seeing this happen, and I know Zelensky behind the scenes was saying to the US, how do I stop this? How do I make this stop? Even though publicly he was saying, we don't know that. Stop trying to
Yeah.
scare everybody. What my question for you is, what was the CIA doing to try to thwart Putin from launching the full scale invasion?
Um, that's a good question. Where I was at the time, I wouldn't really be cited on probably the most sensitive things. But I would say that I think the public diplomacy was actually pretty crucial, and that was a strategy to try to discourage, to basically galvanize as many partners as they can, because European partners were definitely skeptical. Across the European Union was a lot of skepticism on whether or not this was actually happening, particularly with the three military buildups in 2021, which was just sort of look like feints. But in fact, we're, in many cases, sort of moving material close to the border, and stockpiling. Um, it's a good question. I think there was, like I said, the public diplomacy was huge, and it was definitely sort of an interagency approach.
Yeah, but more of the behind the
Yeah,
scenes actual.
yeah, yeah. That's a good question. I mean, other than just sort of telling them they shouldn't, I don't know what, because the nature of the relationship was almost like absent. There's not much there. So you don't really have any sort of leverage points at that point. You can threaten, swift removal and all these things, but then you have to be willing to back it up when you know that this stuff, because again, we understood that this was happening months before, D-Day. And so when you start to like come at um an adversary like that with a set of consequences, you got to be ready to back that up. And then, as we saw, as we talked about earlier, our risk assessment was misplaced. Like almost every chapter of this war, we were sort of erring on the side of way too much caution. So you can imagine in advance, you're not going to say something like, if you come across the border, we're going to use conventional weapons only and destroy anyone that comes across. Like, you're not going to say that because we weren't willing to do something like that at the time. So I can't imagine there was really consequential teeth.
Yeah. Were there any information operations that they could have used to sway the master of all information operations, of who came from a country that invented the word disinformation?
Yeah, I'm not confident we would be effective in that space at all.
Hmm, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Would care to share more on that?
That would be a long and interesting discussion. I'm skeptical of our information operations capability.
Okay, let's talk about that
Yeah.
tomorrow.
Yeah.
Um, okay, well, we're coming to the end of the hour, so here's my last question for you.
Sure.
You kind of alluded to this. For basically 3.5 years now, we have all been asking the question of how does this war end?
Yeah.
For basically 3.5 years now. If
Sure.
that is not the right question to have
Mhm.
been asking, then what the hell is?
I mean, the flip side is just how do we help it end? And I think we all know the answer. And it's to provide the aid that helps actually move the needle on the lines on the ground, that actually forces the Russians to withdraw. And people immediately start going to, well, you don't want to back Putin into a corner and this, that. He doesn't. Like, I think Santa Marin said it as clearly as possible, 2.5 years ago. He can just leave. He can just leave. His back is not against any wall here. He can say, well, politically he's all in. I mean, we can talk ourselves into that space where we can't do anything, and I think that's largely the problem of how we discuss, like, how does it end, is we kind of get quickly into these um, end of the world scenarios, like immediately in any scenario other than, you know, a capitulation right now. And capitulation is just simply not going to happen
Yeah.
without one side just absolutely exhausted.
I mean, I have to give Putin credit for the fact that he aptly calculated that people would lose interest
Hmm.
and support over time, that in
Yeah,
some ways time would be on his side. And that is something that former CIA Director Bill Burns drew attention to, the fact that Putin believed that he could basically
yeah,
have attrition in terms of not just uh, the forces who are duking it out on the ground, but people in the United States and even Western partners. How much do we give them? How long does this go on for?
right. Yeah, and I think we obviously have an incredibly short attention span. You know, not just in, sort of a media sense, but it definitely in a policy sense. We want solutions. We like quick wins. There's all these sort of things built into how we think. I mean, even just to sort of like, how does it end? Question, which is a good question, but like we constantly ask it. And it's, again, you're 3.5 years into something. And I'll give you an analogy that's not quite a perfect analogy, but, having spent a lot of time in Afghanistan during the global war on terror, people rightly said, around 2009, in terms of like inside the agency, when we're looking at our strategies, hey, we're not in year 8 of this thing. We're in year 1 for the 8th time, because we keep thinking through the wrong prisms here about like how we staff, how we train, like how many people were in Pashto language, how many people were in Dari, how many people were in Urdu, like virtually none. By 2009, you're like, how is that possible? It's because we constantly are preparing for like a very short term thing. And, in some extent, that can happen to us in a Ukraine scenario, because there's actual missiles flying, that forces decisions in the United States government in terms of like how our staffing posture looks. So you're going to constrain your staffing. They're going to have far shorter tenures. You're not going to have a 3-year tour. You're probably going to have a 1-year tour. You're like, that's just the nature of this. And what happens is now you're having to, instead of find a team and put them in place for 3 years, you're having to find a whole team every year, which means you're going to start bringing in a lot of people who've never worked these issues. They don't have the language. They don't have the relationships. They don't have the actual experiences to like know, like, oh, that means this. Um, and again, you start getting into this, you do get into a habit where you're sort of doing everything over and over again. And our partners on the other side are the same people year after year after year. And they see that, and they see the degradation of, again, the jointness that I mentioned earlier. Um, that's, that's a huge consequence that hurts our ability to actually think through this. So like, you get to the point, like, so what are we supposed to be thinking about here? Right. So thinking about winning, like, what's the end state? What does winning look like? Define what winning looks like here, and then go get it.
Right.
Figure it out. Figure it
But
out.
then Putin does his nuclear
Hmm.
saber
Yeah.
rattling, and then the United States is scared of a
Yes.
Ukrainian win. And that also very much played into the Biden
Yes.
administration's thinking, as far as I
Correct.
felt in covering it. So yeah, I feel a little bit comfortable saying that it's easier as a journalist to be asking the questions
Yeah.
than solving the problem. I have the luxury of not having to answer the questions
Yeah.
myself.
No, no. And let me make a comment here too, sort of along those lines. I think we were very vulnerable during the previous administration to that sort of nuclear blackmail. And I'll give you an example. Before the full invasion, I remember I was having a conversation with a friend in DOD, special operations, very compartmented, talented, read into a lot of things. And I said, are we not going to help them, or what? Because there was indications that we're not going to be in a position to help the way we should help the Ukrainians. And I don't want to get into the weeds of what I mean by that, but we weren't really going to lean in and like help them here. And this was early on. Obviously different decisions are made once it gets to the highest levels, and weapons start getting provided. But if you remember, full invasion started, like we weren't really providing anything. It took a while before we started providing the actual material, because again, our assessments were this was going to all fall apart in a couple of days. Our assessments are wrong. That's a key feature of what I'm about to say. So I'm talking with him. He's like, look, we look at things like if we go in on the ground, even in like a support role, we've done, sort of tabletop exercises on this to sort of see where this goes, and it goes nuclear really, really fast. So we're probably just not going to be able to do it. And you're like, that's the guidance that's going up now, or the assessments that are going up to decision makers as these policy meetings are having. Like, what are we going to do? Like, how are we going to respond? So again, we sort of paralyze ourselves, and that was under the context of we can't provide them weapons and be there with them. You're like, okay, well, that was proven to be false, right? Like, and then sort of each step of the way, we sort of have this overdone risk calculus where we can't do X, can't give them ATACMS, can't give them DPICMS, can't give them airplanes, can't do this, like, and then we do the thing, and the world doesn't end. So but we don't have the sort of like hot wash to say, okay, why did we come to that conclusion? What
Because the
conclusions?
United States bought into the narrative of
Mhm,
Russian
mhm.
imperialism.
Yeah. But if you keep doing it over and over again in a short compressed time frame, like it's shocking to me that when it was just continuing to happen. You're saying like it's the same people. Like, where's the self-awareness? But again, I don't want to. It's not really. I actually think it's not time well spent to spend time right now, kind of looking at the previous administration, and we can have that discussion in another time about, like, let's do the historical hot wash of this, because they are no longer in power, and I don't want to spend a lot of time kind of like beating that up, because like it's a closed chapter, and they did what they thought, and they did quite a bit, and it did matter. I wish they did a lot more. But you know what? My wish is not relevant.
Yeah. And so looking back on the time that you spent in Ukraine, um, and where we are right now, here you are in DC,
Mhm.
um, just wanted to get your emotional state,
Yeah.
a sort of reading of your emotional state right now. And then I can leave it there with you, unless you wanted to share something more. If there was a question that I didn't ask you that you wanted to talk about. But when you've been on the ground in
Mhm.
Ukraine, and you know Ukrainians,
Mhm.
see what kind of people they are, how much they believe in democracy. I spent a couple weeks there last summer. It's different than seeing it on TV,
Yeah.
reading about it. Numbers don't mean anything, but the people that you see face to face really changes the way you feel about something. So I just wanted to get a
Yeah.
sense from you.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I have a lot of Ukrainian friends that I stay in touch with. I'm there quite a bit, and I sort of mix in different ecosystems, defense tech, and NGOs, and a bunch of things. And I see incredible people fighting for their life, and they want freedom, they want autonomy, they want sovereignty. It's no different from us, like in that respect, and it's righteous, and you want to see them do well, you want to see them win, you want to see them victorious in this scenario, and you want to see Russia pull back, um, and get out of Ukraine. Um, I think that this administration can play a support role, and what's that support role? If the support role is selling hardware to Europeans, who then donate or do whatever they do with Ukraine to make sure Ukrainians have what they need from a hardware standpoint. If that's the best scenario that we can paint here, that's probably good. I don't know that, we don't really have. I don't know what kind of a leadership role we have in this discussion right now. You have two belligerents. It's a sort of a co-leadership role between two belligerents and a whole bunch of European leaders. I think the best scenario is us in a support role at this point. And just following, sort of the leads of the Europeans, and um, let them support the Ukrainians, and we support them.
Ed Bogan, former senior CIA operations officer who spent tremendous amount of time in Ukraine doing things that I still really want to know about. Um, Thank you so much for speaking, and for everybody who joined us live this morning. Appreciate you taking the time. Ed has some really cool things cooking that I'm sure we'll talk about at another point, but just make sure that you keep him on your radar. And appreciate you following Human, and anyone who becomes a paid subscriber, I thank you even more because you keep me going. And we'll definitely stay tuned on what happens later today when President Trump and Zelensky meet. So thanks again.
Thank you, Sasha. Really appreciate it.